The bar smelled of brine, spilled drinks, and damp desperation. Jonah Kane leaned back in his creaking chair, boots propped on the edge of a crusted table as he surveyed the chaos around him. Tentacles, shimmering scales, and gills surrounded him, each creature shouting in languages he barely recognized. The deep current, as this hole in the coral was aptly named, sat in the heart of Thalassara's floating city, a ragtag collection of interlinked platforms swaying atop an endless ocean. Jonah swirled the alien drink in his hand, its sickly green hue catching the glow of bioluminescent jellyfish hanging in orbs overhead. The drink was vile, like licking a rusted pipe, but it was the cheapest option. He needed every spare credit to fix his ship, currently half sunk and sputtering on the outskirts of the city's docks. The Wanderer was his only home, and right now, it was little more than a glorified raft. He had barely taken another sip of the sludge when the air shifted. Conversations stilled, laughter died, and even the creak of the bar seemed to pause. Jonah glanced up, his instincts prickling at the unnatural quiet. That's when he saw her. She strode in like she owned the place. Maybe she did. She moved with a liquid grace, her tall, lean frame commanding attention with every step. Her violet skin shimmered like starlight reflected on water, the crystalline fins on either side of her head catching the dim light as they swayed with her movements. Her hair, a cascade of dark, metallic waves, framed a face so arresting it felt carved by the gods themselves. Captain Calyx Serenia. Jonah had heard the name whispered in hushed tones across ports and backwater outposts. Pirate, legend, ghost. Her reputation was as fearsome as it was alluring. They said no one could resist her. She could topple fleets with a smile, bend kingdoms to her will with a single glance. He wasn't impressed. As she crossed the room, every eye tracked her. A tentacled alien at the bar slumped to the floor in a lovesick stupor. A hulking, amphibious brute with luminescent scars clutched his chest, wheezing as if his heart couldn't keep pace with his infatuation. Jonah? He sipped his drink. Her gaze locked on him instantly, her glowing amethyst eyes narrowing. That predatory smirk, sharp and confident, spread across her lips. She stalked toward him, the crowd parting as if compelled by some unseen force. "You," she said, her voice smooth as velvet, yet edged with steel. "You're not affected." Jonah leaned back in his chair, one eyebrow arched. Affected by what? Her smile widened, revealing sharp, pearl-like teeth. "By me. I'll try to live with the disappointment," he said, tipping his drink in mock salute. For a moment, surprise flickered across her face. Then, amusement softened her features. She slid into the chair across from him, leaning her elbows on the table. Up close, she was even more stunning, her violet skin seeming to pulse faintly with energy. "You're human," she said, more a statement than a question. "Good guess." "And immune. To what?" Jonah asked, though a part of him wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "My curse." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I'm irresistible. Anyone who looks at me falls under my spell. They become obsessed, helpless to deny me anything. Yet here you are, unimpressed and drinking." She sniffed at his glass, wrinkling her nose. "That?" Jonah shrugged. "Maybe I just have high standards." Her laugh was low, almost musical, but there was a hint of bitterness beneath it. "Or maybe humans are the one species in the galaxy that my curse doesn't work on. And this is a problem for you? You could say that." She leaned back, crossing her legs. The movement was fluid, practiced, yet Jonah noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. "I need you," he snorted, taking another sip of his drink. "Lady, I'm not exactly in a helpful mood. My ship's trashed, my credits are thin, and the last thing I need is someone else's problems." Her smirk returned, sharper this time. "Your ship, the Wander, right? Docked at the east platform, leaking coolant and half-submerged?" Jonah froze, his grip tightening on the glass. "How do you know that?" "I know a lot of things, Jonah Kane," she said, her voice a purr. "I know you're an ex-salvager, wandering the stars looking for jobs that pay just enough to keep you moving. I know you've made enemies in more systems than you can count, and I know that without my help, your precious ship will be scrapped by dawn." He set the glass down with deliberate calm. "Let's say you're right. What's in it for me?" Her eyes glimmered with mischief. "Treasure. Enough to fix your ship and buy you a new one. And freedom from this floating dump." Jonah tilted his head, studying her. "And all I have to do is—" "What?" She hesitated, the confidence in her posture faltering just enough for him to notice. "Break my curse," she said finally. "Aha!" He leaned forward, folding his arms on the table. "And how exactly does one break a curse like yours?" Her smirk returned, but this time it was almost vulnerable. "That," she said softly, "is something we'll figure out together." Jonas sighed, running a hand through his hair. Every instinct told him to walk away, to leave her and her curse behind. But something about her intrigued him, something beyond the shimmer of her skin or the allure of her voice. "Fine," he said at last, standing. "But if this goes sideways, don't say I didn't warn you." "Oh, it will go sideways," she said, rising to her feet. "With me, it always does." As they left the bar, the stares of the patrons followed them like shadows, some filled with longing, others with envy. Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into the kind of trouble that came with no escape. The worst part? He didn't hate it. The Crimson Siren wasn't just a ship, it was a masterpiece. As Jonah followed Calyx up the gangplank, he couldn't help but admire the vessel's sleek lines, carved from an otherworldly wood that shimmered like obsidian under Thalassura's twin moons. The sails weren't sails at all, but translucent energy shields, glowing faintly as they swayed in the wind. It hovered above the water, a marvel of engineering and magic that felt alive underfoot. He didn't have long to marvel before the crew descended. "Captain," a reptilian alien with vibrant orange scales and piercing yellow eyes sprinted to greet her, bowing low. Behind him, a pair of cephalopod-like deckhands watched her with reverence, their gelatinous arms still dripping with seawater. A chorus of voices erupted, every crew member clamoring to assist her, to praise her, to simply be near her. Jonah frowned. It wasn't normal devotion. The way they gazed at her bordered on worship, their expressions vacant, almost hollow. "Dismissed," Calyx said, her tone firm yet musical. The crew immediately scattered, though their eyes lingered on her like moths drawn to a flame. She turned to Jonah, catching the question on his face. "You're wondering if it's the curse?" He nodded. "It is. They're loyal, yes, but not by choice. It's suffocating." For the first time, her voice lost its playful edge, dipping into something raw. Then, as if catching herself, she flashed a smile and gestured toward the deck. "Come, let me show you where you'll be staying." As they walked, Jonah couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. The Crimson Siren was alive with activity, but the crew's every movement was tethered to Calyx's presence. They polished railings that already gleamed, adjusted sails that needed no adjustment. Even their laughter felt forced, the sound too brittle to be genuine. "You keep them busy," Jonas said. "It keeps them sane," Calyx replied without looking back. She led him below deck, the interior of the ship as intricate as its exterior. Walls of polished wood glowed faintly with bioluminescent inlays, casting the narrow corridors in soft blues and greens. They stopped outside a small cabin, the door creaking as she pushed it open. "This is yours," she said, stepping aside. Jonah glanced around. The room was sparse but clean, the single cot and small porthole more than he'd expected. Still, it didn't feel welcoming. Nothing about this ship did. "You don't trust me yet," Calyx said, leaning against the doorframe. "I don't trust anyone," Jonah replied. Her smirk returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good. You'll survive longer that way." Dinner that night was served in the ship's galley, a cavernous space that smelled of spices Jonah couldn't name. The crew gathered around a long, curved table, the atmosphere eerily quiet despite the number of people present. Calyx took her place at the head, a throne-like chair that elevated her above the others. Jonah chose a seat near the far end, ignoring the hostile glares from the rest of the crew. A pale-skinned alien with iridescent scales leaned toward him, her wide eyes narrowed. "You don't belong here, human." Jonah stabbed a piece of unidentifiable meat with his fork. You're probably right. The alien hissed, but said nothing more, her attention snapping back to Calyx as the captain raised her glass. To the next horizon, Calyx said, her voice ringing through the room. To the captain, the crew echoed, their voices unified in fervor. Jonah sipped his drink, watching Calyx as she effortlessly commanded the room. Every smile, every glance, every carefully timed laugh seemed to wrap the crew tighter around her finger. Yet when her eyes flicked to him, there was something different in her expression, something unscripted. After the meal, Jonah found himself summoned to her quarters. The captain's cabin was a stark contrast to the rest of the ship. Where the other rooms were functional, hers was opulent. Silk drapes hung from the ceiling, swaying gently with the ship's movements. A large desk dominated the room, covered in maps, artifacts, and trinkets that hinted at countless adventures. Calyx stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of Thalassura's moons. You didn't toast, she said without turning around. Jonah leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. Didn't feel like lying. She turned, her lips curling into a faint smile. You don't think I'm worth following? I don't think anyone is. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the distant hum of the ship. Then she stepped closer, her violet skin gleaming under the cabin's dim lights. You're different, Jonah, she said, her voice soft. The others fall over themselves to please me, to prove their devotion. But you? You don't care. Why? Jonah shrugged. Maybe I've met enough gods to know they're just people with good PR. Her laugh was genuine this time, a low, melodic sound that made something in his chest tighten. You're not like anyone I've met, she said, her tone quieter now. And that scares me more than you can imagine. Jonah raised an eyebrow. You? Scared? Terrified, she admitted, stepping so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her. Her voice dropped, carrying a note of vulnerability he hadn't expected. This curse has controlled my life for so long. I don't know who I am without it. And now here you are, the one person who might actually break it. The weight of her words settled over him, heavy and unyielding. He wanted to say something, to break the tension, but before he could, the ship jolted violently. Calyx steadied herself against the desk, her expression hardening. What now? Jonah followed her to the window, his stomach sinking as he saw the dark shapes rising from the water. Company, he muttered. The sea outside churned as shadowy figures emerged, their sleek, aquatic bodies glistening under the moonlight. They moved with predatory precision, their weapons gleaming in the darkness. Rival pirates, Calyx said, her voice cold. Looks like someone didn't get the memo about whose waters these are. Jonah turned to her, his jaw tightening. I take it talking isn't an option? Her smile returned, sharper than before. Where's the fun in that? She grabbed a blade from her desk and headed for the door, pausing only to glance over her shoulder. Coming human? Jonah sighed, the adrenaline already kicking in. Guess I don't have a choice. As the sounds of battle erupted above deck, he followed her, realizing with grim certainty that this was only the beginning of the trouble he'd signed up for. The surface of Thalassura's ocean stretched endlessly, a restless expanse of silver and black under the twin moons. Jonah stood at the edge of the Crimson Siren's deck, the gentle sway of the ship beneath his boots doing nothing to calm his nerves. The dive suit clung to him like a second skin, its polymer surface cool against his back. Around him, the crew buzzed with quiet activity, though their glances flicked toward Calyx every few seconds, their movements unconsciously syncing with hers like moths drawn to an unseen flame. You're stalling, Calyx said, appearing at his side with an almost predatory grace. Her own suit gleamed faintly, its sleek design accentuating the alien beauty of her violet skin and the crystalline fins that framed her face. She adjusted the clasp of her helmet, her sharp gaze fixed on the water below. Getting cold feet? I'm trying to remember why I agreed to this, Jonah muttered, checking the oxygen levels on his tank. Because I promised you treasure, she said with a faint smirk. And because you can't resist a good mystery, no matter how much you pretend otherwise. Jonah glanced at her. In the pale moonlight, her amethyst eyes shimmered like the ocean itself, deep and unreadable. If we die down there, I'm blaming you. Blame me all you want, she said, pulling her helmet into place. Just don't slow me down. With that, she stepped onto the diving platform and disappeared into the depths, her body slicing through the water with the elegance of a predator. Jonah hesitated for half a breath, then followed, the cold ocean swallowing him whole. The underwater world of Thalassara came alive as Jonah descended. The light from the moons barely penetrated the surface, but the seafloor below glowed with an eerie bioluminescence. Strange plants swayed in the current, their long, translucent fronds radiating faint blues and greens. Schools of glowing fish darted around him, their movements synchronized in perfect harmony. Jonah adjusted the thrusters on his suit, propelling himself forward to keep pace with Calyx, who moved with a fluidity that bordered on unnatural. Her crystalline fins shimmered faintly, casting small halos of light that danced across the ocean floor. Stay close. Her voice crackled through the comms. The currents around the temple can pull you off course if you're not careful. I noticed, Jonah replied, glancing at his instruments. The pressure was steadily increasing as they descended, the weight of the water pressing against him. He could feel it in his chest, a constant reminder of how far they were from the safety of the surface. The first signs of the temple appeared as they reached a rocky outcropping. Massive spires of coral twisted upward like jagged fingers, their surfaces covered in glowing glyphs that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The structure loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the illuminated seabed. That's it? Jonah asked, the size of the temple sinking in. It wasn't just a ruin. It was colossal, carved directly into the ocean floor. Its entrance was a gaping maw, framed by statues of serpentine creatures with wide, empty eyes. That's it, Calyx confirmed, her voice quieter now. The Temple of the Tidebringer, the place where my curse began. Jonah resisted the urge to press for details. He knew enough to understand that whatever had happened to her here, it wasn't something she wanted to relive. Instead, he followed her lead, his eyes scanning the darkness for movement. The first attack came without warning. A shadow darted past Jonah's periphery, too fast to track. He froze, his knife already in hand, his pulse spiking. Another blur shot toward him, a sleek, eel-like creature with needle-sharp teeth. He slashed out instinctively, the blade slicing through the water and grazing its side. Black ichor spilled into the current as the creature retreated with a high-pitched screech. Eels, Calyx said, her tone sharp. Temple guardians. Don't let them surround you. Fantastic, Jonah muttered, turning just in time to see another eel lunging toward him. He drove his knife into its mouth, the impact vibrating up his arm as the creature thrashed before going limp. Calyx moved with deadly precision, her own blade flashing in the dim light as she dispatched an eel with a single strike. She turned to Jonah, her expression tight. There'll be more. Keep moving. They swam toward the temple's entrance, their movements quick and deliberate. The eels seemed to sense their determination, and the attacks grew more frequent. Jonah's muscles burned with effort, but he fought with the desperation of a man who knew retreat wasn't an option. When they finally reached the entrance, the eels retreated, their sleek bodies disappearing into the shadows. Jonah pressed his back against the cold stone, catching his breath as Calyx studied the carvings on the temple's archway. This is the place, she said softly, running her fingers over the glyphs. Her voice carried a note of reverence, tinged with something darker. The curse started here. If the legends are true, it can end here too. What happens if the legends are wrong? Jonah asked. Calyx glanced at him, her lips curving into a faint, humorless smile. Then we'll have come a long way for nothing. Before he could respond, she placed her hand against the door. The glyphs flared to life, their light spilling across the water in intricate patterns. The stone rumbled, sliding open to reveal a long, narrow corridor. Jonah stepped in after her, his instincts on high alert. The walls of the corridor were covered in more carvings, each telling a story in a language he couldn't decipher. The air grew heavy, the magic in the temple pressing against his senses like an invisible tide. At the end of the corridor, they entered a massive chamber. The ceiling stretched beyond sight, and the walls glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it rested a crystalline orb that pulsed with rhythmic light, as though it were alive. "This is it," Calyx whispered, her voice barely audible. She stepped forward, her movements hesitant for the first time since they'd started the dive. Jonah followed, his gaze fixed on the orb. "What happens now?" She stopped in front of the pedestal, her hands trembling as she reached for the orb. "If the curse can be broken, it starts here." "And if it can't?" Jonah asked. Calyx turned to him, her eyes shadowed with something he couldn't quite name. "Then we find another way. We don't give up." For the first time, Jonah saw the cracks in her armor, the weight of centuries spent fighting a battle she hadn't chosen. He didn't respond, but his hand brushed against hers briefly, a silent promise. She took a deep breath and touched the orb. The chamber erupted with light. The force of it sent Jonah stumbling backward, his vision overwhelmed by the blinding glow. The air grew hot, vibrating with energy that made his skin crawl. Through the chaos, he could hear Calyx's voice, strained and filled with pain. When the light finally dimmed, she was on her knees, her shoulders heaving. Jonah rushed to her side, his heart hammering. "Calyx, are you?" "It didn't work," she said, her voice hoarse. Before he could respond, the walls of the chamber began to shift, the carvings twisting into grotesque shapes. The hum of magic grew louder, and Jonah felt the air grow colder. "We're not alone," Calyx said, pushing herself to her feet. Her blade was already in hand, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion in her features. Jonah drew his knife, his jaw tightening. "Next time, let's pick a temple without death traps." Calyx smiled faintly, her voice steady. "Where's the fun in that?" The shadows around them began to move, and Jonah tightened his grip. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. The chamber pulsed with life. Shadows danced across the walls as the carvings twisted, their glowing patterns unraveling like threads from an ancient tapestry. Jonah tightened his grip on his knife, his heart hammering in his chest. The air crackled with energy, oppressive and cold, making it hard to breathe. "Calyx, move!" he shouted, scanning the room for the source of the disturbance. She was still by the pedestal, her hand on the orb, her body rigid. The glow surrounding her had dimmed, but the strain in her face told Jonah she was holding back something much worse. "I can't," she gasped, her voice strained. Something's pulling me in." Jonah didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing her wrist and yanking her back. The moment their skin touched, a sharp current jolted through him, like grabbing live wires underwater. He gritted his teeth and pulled harder, dragging her away from the pedestal as the orb flared brightly, then dimmed, the runes on its surface flickering weakly. They both collapsed onto the cold stone floor. Calyx's breathing was ragged, her glowing violet eyes dull with exhaustion. Jonah crouched beside her, one hand on her shoulder. "What the hell was that?" "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she muttered, her voice shaking. "The curse, something's protecting it. The magic, it's fighting back." Before Jonah could respond, the shadows in the room solidified. They rose from the floor, forming tall, spindly figures with elongated limbs and hollow, glowing eyes. Their movements were slow and deliberate, but their intent was unmistakable. "Temple Guardians," Calyx said, her voice steadier now. She pushed herself to her feet, drawing her blade. "They were created to protect the curse." "Of course they were," Jonah muttered, flipping his knife in his hand. "Because nothing about this is ever easy." The first guardian lunged at them, its clawed hand slicing through the air with unnerving speed. Jonah sidestepped, slashing at its arm. The blade passed through it, meeting little resistance, as if the creature were made of mist. "Great," Jonah said, backing away. "How do you kill something that isn't solid?" "Not with brute force," Calyx snapped, slicing at another guardian that darted toward her. "The glyphs, the carvings on the walls. They're connected to the guardians. We have to disrupt them." Jonah glanced at the glowing runes that lined the chamber's walls. They pulsed in tandem with the movements of the guardians, like a heartbeat. He bolted toward the nearest wall, dodging the swipe of a clawed hand as he plunged his knife into one of the glyphs. The glow flickered and dimmed, and the nearest guardian let out a piercing wail, its form disintegrating into a cloud of smoke. "That works," Jonah shouted. "Keep going," Calyx called, driving her blade into another glyph. Her movements were fluid, precise, but there was a ferocity in her strikes that Jonah hadn't seen before. For the first time, she didn't look untouchable. She looked mortal. More guardians emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on Jonah and Calyx as they worked to destroy the glyphs. Jonah's knife flashed as he carved through another glowing rune, his muscles burning from the effort. He could feel the pressure of the room intensifying, the weight of the magic pressing against his chest like an invisible tide. Calyx fought beside him, her crystalline fins catching the faint light as she moved. Her breathing was labored, but she didn't falter. "This magic isn't just protecting the curse," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "It's feeding off it. It's alive." Jonah gritted his teeth, slashing through another glyph. "Then let's starve it." The room shuddered as the last glyph dimmed. The guardians froze, their forms flickering like dying embers before they dissolved into nothingness. The oppressive energy in the air began to fade, leaving behind an eerie silence. Jonah leaned against the wall, catching his breath. His arms ached, his chest heaved, but relief washed over him like a tide. "Please tell me that's the worst this place has to offer." Calyx didn't respond immediately. She was standing by the pedestal, staring at the orb. Its glow was faint now, the runes on its surface barely visible. "It's weakened," she said quietly, "but it's not gone." Jonah pushed off the wall, walking toward her. "So what now? You said the temple was the key to breaking the curse." "It is," she said, turning to face him. There was a weariness in her expression, but also something deeper, something vulnerable. "But this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. The curse isn't tied to the orb itself. It's tied to the magic that created it. And that magic—" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. Jonah stepped closer, his voice softer now. "What is it, Calyx?" She looked up at him, her violet eyes glistening. "The magic came from me." For a moment, the words didn't register. Jonah stared at her, his mind racing. "What do you mean from you?" Calyx exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders visible. "When I was cursed, the sorcerer didn't just use his power. He used mine. He drew it out of me, twisted it, and turned it against me. That's why I can't break it on my own. The curse isn't just a spell, it's a part of me." Jonah ran a hand through his hair, his mind struggling to keep up. "So breaking the curse means what? Destroying that part of you?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But I do know that the longer the curse exists, the more it consumes me. If we don't stop it, there won't be anything left of who I was." The weight of her words settled heavily between them. Jonah studied her, the defiance in her posture, the vulnerability in her eyes. For all her sharp wit and commanding presence, she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't face alone. "We'll figure it out," Jonah said finally. His voice was firm, steady. Calyx tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You say that like you have a plan?" "Not yet," he admitted, returning her smile. "But I'm good at winging it." For the first time, her laugh was genuine, soft, and melodic. "I'll hold you to that, Jonah Kane." As they turned to leave the chamber, the faint hum of the orb echoed behind them, a reminder that their fight was far from over. But for now, they had survived. And for the first time, Jonah felt that survival meant something more than just staying alive. The crimson siren rocked gently on Thalassura's endless ocean, its hull whispering creaks into the quiet night. The stars above burned brightly, mirrored in the still water, creating the illusion of floating in an infinite void. Jonah leaned on the ship's railing, his knife resting loosely in his hand. The air was humid and thick with the smell of salt, but it wasn't the ocean that weighed on him. His thoughts churned like the water below. The temple, the guardians, the orb. It all felt like the edge of something much larger, something he wasn't prepared to face. And then there was Calyx, enigmatic and infuriating, standing in the middle of it all like a storm waiting to break. She appeared behind him without a sound, her crystalline fins catching the moonlight. Jonah didn't turn, but sensed her presence, sharp and electric as always. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with curiosity. Jonah smirked, still staring out at the horizon. "Not with everything we've been through today." "You?" Calyx stepped closer, her hands gripping the railing beside him. "Sleep and I have never been friends." Her voice had a weight to it that caught Jonah off guard. She sounded tired. "You don't seem the type to lose sleep over much," he said, glancing at her. Her lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You'd be surprised." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Jonah studied her in the moonlight, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze lingered on the water, as if searching for answers in its depths. "What is it?" he asked finally. She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the railing. "This curse, it's not just something that was done to me. It's me. It's tied to every part of who I am, and I'm not sure if breaking it will leave anything of me behind." Jonah straightened, his brow furrowing. "That's not true. You're more than this curse." She laughed softly, though the sound was bitter. "Am I? You've seen how they look at me, Jonah. The crew, the people in that bar, even the pirates who attacked us, they don't see me. They see the curse, the power, the illusion. I don't," Jonah said firmly. Her eyes met his then, wide and uncertain. "Why not? Why are you immune?" Jonah shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe because I don't look for illusions. I see what's real. And what I see is someone who's fought harder than anyone I've ever met to keep her head above water. Someone who doesn't give up, no matter what." The air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. Calyx looked away first, her voice barely audible. "Sometimes I wonder what it would feel like to be seen like that. Just once." Jonah's heart twisted at the vulnerability in her tone. Before he could second-guess himself, he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers where they rested on the railing. "You don't have to wonder." Calyx stilled at his touch, her breath hitching. Slowly, she turned to face him, her violet eyes searching his. For the first time, the mask she wore, the confidence, the defiance, slipped entirely. What was left was raw, achingly human. "You're serious," she whispered, as if testing the weight of his words. Jonah stepped closer, closing the space between them. "I've never been more serious." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she reached up, her fingers grazing his jaw. The touch was tentative, hesitant, as if she wasn't sure it was allowed. Jonah leaned into it, his hand moving to her waist. "Calyx," he murmured, his voice low. She silenced him with a kiss. It was tentative at first, a brush of lips that carried years of guarded walls crumbling. But when Jonah responded, deepening the kiss, it became something else entirely. Her hands slid to his shoulders, gripping him as though he were an anchor in a storm. Jonah's fingers tightened on her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. Her body was warm against his, her breath mingling with his own. The ship's faint creaks and the distant sound of waves faded, leaving only the two of them. Calyx broke the kiss first, her forehead resting against his as she caught her breath. "This isn't smart," she whispered, though there was no conviction in her words. Jonah chuckled softly. "Smart doesn't suit me." She laughed then, a real, unguarded sound that made Jonah's chest tighten. "You're impossible." "Maybe. But you kiss me first," he teased. Calyx smirked, though her expression softened as her fingers traced the edge of his jaw. "I did." They stood there for a moment, the world seeming to hold its breath. But when Calyx stepped back, her face grew serious again. "Jonah, if this goes wrong, if breaking the curse destroys me—" "It won't," he interrupted, his tone firm. "But if it does," she pressed, her voice wavering, "promise me you'll finish what we started. Promise me you'll make sure this curse doesn't hurt anyone else." Jonah stared at her, his chest tightening. "I promise. But I'm not losing you, Calyx. Not to this, not to anything." Her gaze lingered on him, searching for something she couldn't quite name. Finally, she nodded. "We'll see." As she turned and walked toward the helm, Jonah watched her, his resolve hardening. Whatever lay ahead, he wouldn't let her face it alone. For the first time, it wasn't just about the curse or the treasure. It was about her. And for Jonah, that was reason enough to fight. The Crimson Siren sailed into the pre-dawn light, its sleek hull slicing through the calm waters of Thalassara's endless ocean. Jonah stood at the bow, the salty wind tugging at his hair as he stared at the horizon. The stars were fading, giving way to a soft golden glow, but the beauty of the scene barely registered. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the cursed orb below deck, the promise he'd made, and the woman who had become the center of it all. Behind him, the ship creaked faintly, footsteps signaling Calix's approach. He turned as she joined him, her crystalline fins catching the faint morning light. Her violet skin glimmered, but there was a weariness in her posture that she couldn't hide. "You're up early," Jonas said. "I don't sleep much," she replied, her voice softer than usual. "Another thing we have in common," Jonas said with a faint smile, though the tension between them lingered. "We're nearing the coordinates you gave the crew. Are you ready for whatever's waiting out there?" Calix leaned against the railing, her gaze distant. "Ready doesn't matter. What matters is finishing this." Jonas studied her, his brow furrowing. "You're still thinking about what you said last night, aren't you? About the curse destroying you." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You think I'm being dramatic?" "No," Jonas said firmly. "I think you're preparing for the worst. That's smart, but you don't have to carry it alone." Her eyes met his, something unspoken flickering in their depths. "I've been alone for a long time, Jonah. It's hard to stop." "Then let me make it easier," he said, stepping closer. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The soft rustle of the wind filled the silence between them, carrying the scent of salt and something ancient that lingered just beneath the surface. "Do you know why I trusted you?" Calix asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonah tilted his head. "I figured it was because I didn't swoon at the sight of you." Her lips curved into a faint smile, but it was fleeting. "No, it's because you saw through everything. The curse, the power, the facade. You looked at me and saw me, not the woman the galaxy thinks I am. No one's ever done that before." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing hers where it rested on the railing. The touch was light, tentative, but enough to ground them both. "Then trust me now," Jonas said. "We'll break this curse. And when we do, you'll still be standing. You'll still be you." Calix didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand, letting their fingers intertwine. "You're awfully confident for someone who spent most of this journey complaining about water." "I'm confident because I have you," Jonas said, his voice steady. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're impossible." Before Jonah could reply, a shout rang out from the crow's nest. "Land ahead! Looks like ruins!" Calix pulled her hand back, straightening. Her expression shifted instantly, the mask of the captain sliding into place. "That's it," she said, her voice firm. "The source of the curse." The ruins emerged from the mist like jagged teeth, rising from the ocean on a massive outcrop of black stone. The structure was ancient, its spires weathered by centuries of salt and wind. Glyphs similar to those in the temple adorned the walls, glowing faintly even in the daylight. The air around the island felt heavy, charged with magic that made the hair on Jonah's arms stand on end. The crew anchored the ship just offshore, their movements unusually quiet as they worked. Jonah noticed the way they avoided looking directly at the ruins, their expressions tense. "They can feel it," Calix said as she adjusted the strap of the satchel slung across her shoulder. Inside, the cursed orb pulsed faintly, its rhythmic light visible even through the fabric. Jonah nodded. "Hard not to." She turned to him, her gaze steady. "You don't have to come with me." "Not happening," Jonah said immediately. "We do this together." For a moment, Calix's mask cracked, and something soft and raw flickered across her face. Then she nodded, and together they descended into the waiting skiff. The ruins were even more imposing up close. As Jonah and Calix stepped ashore, The magic in the air grew heavier, pressing against them like an invisible tide. The entrance to the structure yawned before them, a massive archway carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe. Calyx hesitated at the threshold, her hand brushing the satchel. Once we step through, there's no turning back. Jonah placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. Then let's make sure we don't have to. They entered the ruins. The interior was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, each more foreboding than the last. The walls pulsed faintly with magic, the light flickering in time with the orb in Calyx's satchel. The air was cold, carrying a faint hum that resonated in Jonah's chest. At the heart of the structure, they found the altar. It was a massive slab of stone, surrounded by pillars inscribed with glowing glyphs. At its center was a basin filled with shimmering liquid, its surface rippling as though stirred by an unseen force. Calyx approached cautiously, her movements deliberate. She set the satchel on the altar and withdrew the orb. The moment it touched the air, the glyphs around the room flared brightly, casting the chamber in harsh light. "This is it," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her body. Jonas stepped beside her. "What now?" Calyx hesitated, then placed the orb in the basin. The liquid hissed and bubbled, and the room trembled as the glyphs shifted, their patterns rearranging into something new. The orb's light grew blinding, and a voice echoed through the chamber, low and ancient, speaking in a language Jonah couldn't understand. Calyx's eyes widened, her hands clutching the edge of the altar as the light enveloped her. "Calyx!" Jonah shouted, grabbing her arm. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered. "It's testing me." The light pulsed again, and Calyx gasped, her body going rigid. Jonah held on tighter, his heart pounding. "What's happening?" "The curse," she choked out. "It's resisting." Jonah didn't think. He pulled her into his arms, grounding her as the magic surged around them. "You're stronger than this," he said fiercely. "You've survived everything it's thrown at you. This is no different." Her breathing steadied, her grip on his arm tightening. The light pulsed one final time before fading, leaving the room in silence. The orb was gone. Calyx slumped against Jonah, her body trembling. He held her tightly, his hand brushing her hair. "It's over," he said softly. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "It's over." And for the first time in centuries, she felt free. The ruins were silent now. The oppressive hum of magic had vanished, leaving an eerie stillness in its place. Jonah held Calyx in his arms, her trembling body gradually calming. The faint glow that had always surrounded her was gone, replaced by a quiet humanity that made her feel startlingly real in his embrace. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonah pulled back enough to meet her eyes. They were no longer shimmering with otherworldly power. They were soft and vulnerable, deep pools of violet that reflected the woman she truly was. "You tell me," he said, his tone steady. Calyx raised a hand, studying her fingers as if expecting the glow to return. It didn't. Her crystalline fins, once bright with pulsating light, now shimmered faintly, natural and unthreatening. She let out a breath she'd been holding for centuries. "It's gone," she murmured, her voice filled with wonder. Her gaze lifted to Jonah, and for the first time, he saw her without the weight of her curse. She looked lighter, freer, yet uncertain, like someone stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. "It's really gone." Jonah smiled, his relief mingling with something warmer. "Told you we'd make it." Calyx let out a shaky laugh, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "You really don't let up, do you? Not when I'm right." He grinned, the tension in his chest finally loosening. The altar, once a beacon of magic, now lay inert, the basin cracked and empty. The glyphs on the walls no longer glowed. They were faded carvings, remnants of a power that no longer held sway over her life. "What now?" Jonah asked after a long moment. Calyx straightened, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. Her expression was thoughtful, almost hesitant. "I don't know. I've spent so long being controlled by that curse. I never thought about what life would look like without it. She glanced at him, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. I guess this is where the captain's supposed to come up with a grand plan. Jonah tilted his head, a teasing smile on his face. You're the captain. Isn't that your job? Maybe, she said, stepping closer, her voice softer now. But I wouldn't mind some help this time. Jonah's grin faded, replaced by something quieter, more serious. You've got it. Whatever comes next, you're not doing it alone. Calix's hand brushed his, and he intertwined their fingers without hesitation. For a moment, they stood there, framed by the ruins and the soft light of the rising sun filtering through the cracks in the walls. Let's get back to the ship, she said, her tone steady but filled with something new. Lead the way, Captain, Jonah replied. The ruins were silent now. The oppressive hum of magic had vanished, leaving an eerie stillness in its place. Jonah held Calix in his arms, her trembling body gradually calming. The faint glow that had always surrounded her was gone, replaced by a quiet humanity that made her feel startlingly real in his embrace. Is it really over? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonah pulled back enough to meet her eyes. They were no longer shimmering with otherworldly power. They were soft and vulnerable, deep pools of violet that reflected the woman she truly was. You tell me, he said, his tone steady. Calix raised a hand, studying her fingers as if expecting the glow to return. It didn't. Her crystalline fins, once bright with pulsating light, now shimmered faintly, natural and unthreatening. She let out a breath she'd been holding for centuries. It's gone, she murmured, her voice filled with wonder. Her gaze lifted to Jonah, and for the first time, he saw her without the weight of her curse. She looked lighter, freer, yet uncertain, like someone stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. It's really gone. Jonah smiled, his relief mingling with something warmer. Told you we'd make it. Calix let out a shaky laugh, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. You really don't let up, do you? Not when I'm right. He grinned, the tension in his chest finally loosening. The altar, once a beacon of magic, now lay inert, the basin cracked and empty. The glyphs on the walls no longer glowed. They were faded carvings, remnants of a power that no longer held sway over her life. What now? Jonah asked after a long moment. Calix straightened, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. Her expression was thoughtful, almost hesitant. I don't know. I've spent so long being controlled by that curse. I never thought about what life would look like without it. She glanced at him, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. I guess this is where the captain's supposed to come up with a grand plan. Jonah tilted his head, a teasing smile on his face. You're the captain. Isn't that your job? Maybe, she said, stepping closer, her voice softer now. But I wouldn't mind some help this time. Jonah's grin faded, replaced by something quieter, more serious. You've got it. Whatever comes next, you're not doing it alone. Calix's hand brushed his, and he intertwined their fingers without hesitation. For a moment, they stood there, framed by the ruins and the soft light of the rising sun filtering through the cracks in the walls. Let's get back to the ship, she said, her tone steady but filled with something new. Lead the way, Captain, Jonah replied.